passages. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. You know, you read this. I hope we don't just read it quickly and miss the power of what's up there. Through the resurrection of Jesus, this is what is possible. This is the promise of God. I want to real quickly look at 4 little passages out of 1 Peter. We're going to do something very different. I'm going to put up on the screen there. I'm going to ask, I don't usually do this, but is there somebody who would stand and read that off the screen? Is somebody who got some brave soul who would do that? I want us to catch the full promise there. Would we do that?
Sure, I'll do it for you.
Thanks, Colin.
Though you do not see him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Absolutely.
What an incredible promise there again, the promise of faith. Promise of the joy. Let's find another one out of this passage, out of this book of Bibles. Can somebody read this?
Okay.
Greg? Okay. Anyway, Greg, I think you're... Well, actually, Greg, you already read. Sean, go for it.
Therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hopes fully on the grace that you will be brought to you in the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Prepare yourself. Be ready. There's certainly going to be problems in life. Prepare yourself. But how? What do you prepare yourself? Through, you know, our hope is through grace. It's not just some random thing. Be ready. There's hope there. I'm going to read one more. I'll read this one because it's longer. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of the darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Why have I done all this? Words out of 2 Peter. Incredible passages. Words of great hope. I mean, go back to what we read in 2 Peter. We have this hope that leads us that we do not stumble. And all these words are words that have pushed the church for generations. Words that we have written to us today that make a difference in our lives. That were written by one of the great heroes and founders of the church. One of those who has made a great difference in this world. Somebody we should look up to. Somebody we should consider important has written these words to us. They are written by Peter, an inspiration and a teacher. Peter, one of the greatest heroes of the Bible and one of the greatest failures of the gospel. I have picked all of these passages because today we come to the section of the Gospel of Mark where Peter is going to let down and fail Jesus. He is going to be a failure. We kind of skipped over a section a little earlier in Mark 14, and that's where we are if you want to follow along in the Bible today. We skipped over a little section that I said I was going to come back to. And Jesus, at the meal in which we have communion, in which the betrayal occurs, he says, do you know what it says? It says in the Old Testament. We strike at the shepherd. And the sheep are going to run away. They're going to scatter. They're going to run away. And everybody says, whoa, 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 are you talking about us? No! No. In fact, Peter gets out in front of them and all and says, you know what? Impossible. I'm willing to die for you. I'm willing to do anything for you. Not going to happen. And Jesus looks at Peter and says, you know what? You, of all of them, Peter, 3 times in the next couple of hours are going to fail me. For the rooster crows in the morning. Keep in mind, this is evening. The rooster's going to crow in the morning before most of us want to get up in the morning. Before that happens, 3 times. Next couple hours, you think you're going to succeed? I'm going away. You are going to be with me. And 3 times in the next few hours, you're going to fail. Well, we know what goes on. If you were with us last time, we came to the rest. Judas comes. He betrays Jesus. He's arrested. That was actually 2 times ago. Last time we went and started the trial. And as the trial is occurring, at least 2 of the disciples are kind of trying to sneak back into position. They're kind of nearby. We don't know what happens to all of them, but we know from the other Gospels that John kind of keeps an eye on things. Peter as well sneaks back, and he goes into the courtyard of the high priest where the first trial is taking place. And he's outside in the courtyard. And as he's outside in the courtyard, a servant girl comes up to him and says, "You were Jesus, right?" Now, sometimes in some of the ways it's being portrayed, it's kind of almost like this unimportant little thing comes up, and Peter quivers in fear at the sight of this woman. I think there is a very strong accusatory tone. If you think back to what happened just an hour ago, maybe that. Judas comes along, arrests Jesus. Peter pulls out his sword, which we talked about was probably more like a knife. He yanked it out. He attacks a gentleman, cuts off his ear. Jesus does a healing. The person whose ear he cut off was a servant of the high priest. This is another servant of the high priest. There can't be that many servants of the high priest around. It wasn't like it was a giant household. They could have been related. They probably, without doubt, knew each other. They're probably coming, "Hey," and it's almost like this, "Hey, aren't you the guy who just cut off my buddy's ear?" And now, the person who you were defending is on trial here. There's an accusatory tone. Peter is being brave enough to follow Jesus into the high priest's place, and now there's an accusation. Now, going to the high priest alone, that takes some bravery. I remember hearing a story that may be somewhat legendary years ago of a gentleman who robbed a bank. He has a gun, wearing the balaclava over his face, goes in, steals the money. Immediately, the alarm is set off. He's running in chase, runs down an alley, finds an open door to hide in, runs into this with his gun in one hand, bag of money in another, wearing a balaclava, runs in, realizes he's run straight into the heart of a police station. Does that look suspicious? Okay, Peter, what has he done? He's basically run into the heart of the police station. And there's an accusation. He knows he's in trouble. Somebody is there. "You are the follower of Jesus." You are... No, you got the wrong guys. We have to ask the question, what do people think? Why is Peter there anyways? It's the middle of the night. Why is he in the high priest's courtyard? I mean, what other reason would he be there other than to be with Jesus? He should be home in bed. The accusation's made. He kind of quivers a little bit, gets scared. What he should have done at this moment is run away. He doesn't. He doesn't run away. He stays there. But immediately, this woman, this servant girl, starts to make a bigger accusation because she publicly outs Peter. Doesn't just make the accusation to Peter that you're with him. She goes to everybody who's outside. I think it's this guy is with Jesus. Now I give Peter great credit at this moment. He does deny Jesus, but I would run away. I'd be sneaking out through the shadows, going to hide somewhere in the darkness. He did a lot better than I would. After this second betrayal, somebody finally says, you know what, I think your accent gives you away. You were clearly from Galilee. You're clearly from Galilee. You got to be with them. And angry curses come flowing out of Peter's mouth. And at that moment, the rooster crows. Peter's mind starts to go back and remembering the prediction. We don't find this in Mark, but in the other Gospels we do find that Jesus is led out at this moment. And at this moment of realization, their eyes meet, their eyes lock. And the look from Jesus is accusatory. And the look that comes back from Peter is pain. It's sorrow. And Peter breaks down. The whole point of this story is not to condemn Peter. The whole point of this story is going to show how we relate to him. Because his plight is ours. You know, Peter's spirit was willing. It's kind of harkens back to we heard a couple weeks ago when they were praying and Jesus said his spirit was willing, flesh was weak. Well, that's kind of Peter. Peter did show some courage. He didn't just show 100% courage. He's close, but not quite. He meant to do well, but he didn't. You know, this is not just a one-time thing, I think, that Peter could relate to. Probably part of his character that he meant often to do well, to do what is right. I know this because it's true in my heart that I often mean to do well and somehow we mess up. We go to Romans 7, very famous little passage in which the Apostle Paul talks about, you know, hey, there's all sorts of things. I know I should do them and I don't do them. What I want to do, I don't do. And what I know I shouldn't do, those are the things I seem to always end up doing. I mean, I want to do what's right, but somehow, I get close. I start doing what's right. Is this ring true in anybody's life? Rings true in my life. I mean well. I mean well. Not a bad person by human standards. And somehow I know I should succeed. I know what I need to do to succeed, but I keep falling. It seems hard to live up to what God has called me to do. I need to back up to understand a little bit of this. If you go back to that prediction a little bit earlier in Mark 14, just before Jesus starts praying in the garden, there's really three parts to the prediction that Jesus gives, saying that they're going to all fall away. The first one is, you're going to be without the shepherd. The sheep are going to be without the shepherd. Second part of it is, because you're going to be sheep without your shepherd, you are going to flee despite your best effort. You are going to run. You are going to be gone. I skipped over a third part when I told the story earlier. And it's probably the most critical part of this whole prediction. It's not so much a prediction as there's a little bit of a command at the end. Guys, the shepherd's going to be struck. You're all going to flee. After it's all done, get together back in Galilee and we're going to meet. Why is that part so critical? Within all of this, you are going to forget who you are. You're going to forget me. And despite yourselves, you're going to flee. And when it's done, we're going to be back together and you're going to get to work. The shepherd will be struck down and the sheep will scatter. It is impossible to do the work without the shepherd. You cannot succeed without Jesus. The whole Christian life is all about Jesus. That's the whole point. But it's not the end of the story when you fail. Do not let failure define you. It is amazing the way that God can take our failures and push us forward. It is so easy, and I have seen it so many times, where either somebody messes up and through the guilt and the shame that they feel, they walk away from Jesus. They walk away from the church. Or perhaps even worse, much worse, that the church might put so much shame and guilt on a person that they walk away. Peter failed so horribly. They all failed. And what's Jesus saying? Once you're done failing, let's get together in Galilee. Let's get back together. Let's meet again, and then we can be ready to do your... You ever fail? You ever mess up? I see a lot of heads going up and down. Does that mean we're done? Not at all. Meet him again. Get back to work. Come back to the shepherd. Why did Peter fail in the first place? I mean, he was so close. He has courage. He does not run in the face of adversity. He knows what needs to be done, and his heart's right. He desperately wants to do it. And yet he still fails. He's still living in the Old Testament. See, in the Old Testament, you try to be as faithful as you can. You come in to see me. Hello. Bye. He really wants to do what is right. And yet he fails. He wants to please God because that's what you do in the Old Testament. You try to please God. So can I just have you go get Emmett, actually? He's going to spill all those flowers. Thank you. I have a vantage point that I see disaster happening in the back. That's okay, because we're talking about disaster and failures, aren't we? So I spoke, but I still don't want him to dump flowers on his head. You cannot succeed without Jesus. Is going to be the bottom line with this. The Old Testament, they tried their hardest to do their best, and it wasn't enough. The solution to this story isn't that Peter should try harder to be a better person. Is it that Peter should spend more time praying? Is it that he should just spend some time trying to be more holy or something like that? Because if he does, he's going to fall into the same trap that most of us do at some point in our Christian lives. That I should just try to be better. We are not called to try better. We are called to submit to Jesus Christ and make him Lord. To follow him, not by trying harder, but to wake up every morning and just say, Jesus, you are the Lord of my life today. Help me to follow you. It's hard. There's a book I come back to every once in a while. I read it years ago. It's called The Saving Life of Christ by Ian Thomas. He starts by quoting 1 Thessalonians 5:24, at least in the section I'm going to read. Faithful is he that calls you, who will do it. The one who calls you to a life of righteousness is the one who by your consent lives that life of righteousness through you. The one who calls you to minister to the needs of humanity is the one who by your consent ministers to the needs of humanity through you. The one who calls you to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature is the one who, by your consent, goes into all the world and preaches the gospel to every creature through you. This is the divine genius that saves a man from the futility of self-effort. It relieves the Christian of the burden of trying to pull himself up by his own bootstraps. If it were not for this divine provision, the call to Christ would be a source of utter frustration, presenting the sorry spectacle of a sincere idealist, constantly thwarted by their own inadequacies. If you will but trust Christ, not only for the death he died in order to redeem you, but also for the life that he lives and waits to live through you, the very next step you take will be a step taken in the very energy and power of God himself. See, Peter had not yet found the secret that's going to come later in the weekend. Later in that very weekend, Jesus is going to rise from the dead. Not just as some great miracle, as an exclamation point in his life. He's going to rise from the dead to give you life. Not just a life to try harder, he's going to give you life that you may live the way that he calls you to do. Submission and surrender and giving ourselves over to the power of the Christ are essential, absolutely, unquestionably necessary, because otherwise we are trying to live as sheep without the shepherd. And sheep without the shepherd just ain't going to make it. But there's a secret to success in all this. This is a great passage. I'm going to tell you why. Peter fails greatly. And yet, at the beginning of the service, I read a section out of Acts 2. Do you know that was written mere weeks after this? He fails, then he gets up and gives a great sermon a couple weeks later. A couple of decades later, he writes what we read out of 1 Peter and 2 Peter. I mean, this is the guy who the Gospels emphasize he failed Jesus, and then he writes big chunks of the Bible. I want us to catch the power of this. He failed, and he gets one of the greatest honors that is ever given anybody who followed Jesus. You know, I don't know if everyone's quite going to catch the power of that. You fail, and maybe that failure is going to take you somewhere bigger. Peter lived quite a life. This great failure, who learned to surrender to God, this great failure becomes one of the greatest leaders that the church ever knew. It begins with Peter and Jesus after he failed, meeting eyes. Their eyes meet. He ends up weeping. He ends up crying. Do you know what? Sometimes restoration, sometimes moving on in the road of life, sometimes discovering meaning in life, all those things can become very painful. Often it has to begin with a little bit of pain. To realize that I am not good enough in and myself. That yes, I failed. Yes, I failed again. But sometimes as we fail, we realize our absolute need of the Lordship of Jesus Christ. And it takes us to somewhere great. Do you think Peter, I should say, would have been the guy who wrote those incredible passages we read if he had not failed? I mean, his things were about how to succeed, how to avoid failure. Most of those passages we read were about what God does for us, who we become in Jesus. They were about how to stay on the right path. Do you think without that great failure, he would have become the man who wrote those passages? This is a pivotal moment. It's so easy to run away from our own failures. Failure should not disqualify us in any way from the Christian life. They move us forward, at least depending on what we do with it. So I was getting ready for this week. I ran across a story of a Scottish evangelist from a generation or two ago. His name was Brownlow North. Would you like a name like Brownlow? He's a man of God, but he had gone through many failures and struggles, particularly early in his life. A lot of things he was particularly ashamed of. And he showed up at a church service in the city of Aberdeen, and he was scheduled to preach and bring the gospel message that day. And as he was going into the church, he was handed a letter. He kind of grabbed the letter as he was walking by. Didn't really think much of it or look at the person who handed it to him. But he took the letter, he opened it up, and he started to read it. And it started off by saying, do you know what? You may not remember me, but I knew you. And I watched your life. And it started to list failure after failure after failure in this evangelist's life, particularly when he was younger. And the bottom of the letter said, I know all these things, and if you get up and preach today, I am going to expose you for each one of these. I will share them, and you will be exposed. Brownlow North got up in front of the congregation that day. He opened the letter, and he read the whole thing out loud to the congregation. Can you imagine if somebody said, I know those things that embarrass you, I'm going to read them at church? How would you feel? He got up and he read that letter in front of everyone. And then he said, each thing listed here was perfectly true. And then told them, but Christ had forgiven each one of them. That he had been able to overcome himself and put his past behind him. And how through Christ he was a new creation. Basically, he used his shame to bring others to Jesus. And that is what Peter did. Mark, we have said, is Peter's gospel. It's Peter's memories. And he tells this story, he wants Mark to tell this story because he wants people to know that he had hurt Jesus immensely through his sin, and yet he was still forgiven. Why is there this great emphasis on this story in this gospel and all the others? Because it's an important story, we should all relate to it. Because we're all parts of this story. Because we can all relate to failure. We can all relate to letting Jesus down. And we can see others and ourselves fall. Not only is it not the end, it's generally the beginning. We let it. Do you know, who am I compared to the great apostle Peter? He fell. He fell very hard. Despite his best efforts, but he learned in falling how much he needed a shepherd. When we fall, we come back to the shepherd. We say, do you know what? I messed up. Help me to make you Lord. We'll sing a song.